Hey guys, welcome to the Phil topic analysis for Resolved. Plea bargaining ought to be abolished in the United States criminal justice system. I'm going to start out by discussing some of the background about plea bargaining to give you guys a sense of what this topic will focus on. Here's a definition by Professor Sarah J. Berman that mirrors a lot of the definitions you're going to find about what constitutes plea bargaining. A plea bargain is an agreement between a defendant and a prosecutor in which the defendant agrees to plead guilty or no contest in exchange for an agreement by the prosecutor to drop one or more charges, reduce a charge to a less serious offense, or recommend to the judge a specific sentence acceptable to the defense. A plea of no contest is a situation in which an individual says that they do not contest the charges that are against them, and the benefit of pleading no contest is that cannot be used against them in a future trial as evidence of their guilt. Plea bargaining can occur at any stage in the trial before the jury has reached a verdict, which means that plea bargaining is not something that is uniform in the way that it will influence the trial process. Plea bargaining is also super prevalent in the criminal justice system and currently decides over 90% of cases. So why do we have plea bargaining? In 1971, in a case, the Supreme Court said that the benefit of plea bargaining was first that it shortens times before sentences as it expedites the criminal justice process. Secondarily, it increases access to rehabilitation by ensuring that individuals have their sentences sooner. And third, decreases the negative impact of individuals waiting for trial, which can sometimes include time in which they're spending in jail. But it's also argued that the reason that we have plea bargaining in the criminal justice system is simply for efficiency, because there are often too many trials for there are too many cases for them to actually all be able to go to trial, which means that it's necessary for there to be plea bargaining because there are simply not the criminal justice resources for every case to go to trial. So I'm going to start off with affirmative positions that I think will either be strong or will be frequently read on this topic that you should definitely be aware about and have blocks against. The primary arguments that you'll see in the Kant/Freedom Aff will be arguments first about the right to trial. So the argument here is that plea bargaining pushes individuals to give up the right to trial, which is something that is necessarily due to them on the basis of their humanity. The idea here is that everyone deserves to have their case heard in trial, and that there's no way that we can assess the guilt or innocence of an individual unless it is in the case of a criminal trial rather than something being decided based on the plea. Another argument here is a criticism of the utilitarian claim that it becomes more efficient when we're able to include plea bargaining into the criminal justice process. The claim is that it places a price on human beings by saying that it is more efficient or will save money if we are able to do plea bargaining because it can play with it something so significant such as individuals' lives, and the impact that something such a criminal sentence will have on them is something that's incredibly significant and should not be taken into consideration simply because it's super efficient. The third and I think strongest argument in a position like this is the argument that plea bargaining is something that fosters coercion. The idea here is that there are a lot of situations in which individuals simply do not have the resources in order to enable a case to be taken to trial. So this might mean that they don't have adequate money to hire sufficient defense, so they believe that they will not be able to have any form of success if the case actually goes to trial. There are also situations in which individuals believe that there are significant biases against them in the criminal justice process, such that a guilty verdict will be reached even if they are innocent. The claim here is that the prosecutor is able to use coercion in order to force an individual to plead guilty, even in a situation in which they might be innocent. Some products of the current criminal justice system would enable this to be more likely, such as the fact that individuals might have a greater sentence if they decide to take a case to trial, which means that there would be a perverse incentive for individuals to plead guilty even in situations in which they are innocent. Coercion is something that is considered bad under most freedom frameworks, particularly under Kant, because individuals are not able to exercise their freedom if they're being coerced by another actor. So I think the largest strength of this position is first that you can look at it from a very critical angle. So there's a lot of critical race scholarship which talks about the influence of plea bargaining on injustice in the criminal justice system and the way that it contributes to mass incarceration, particularly for people of color. I think there's also a very compelling argument that it is practically impossible for there to be equitability in the plea bargaining process given the huge amount of power the prosecutor has over individuals, specifically those that are economically disadvantaged. I think the potential concerns for this AF are first reform counterplans. So this would be a counterplan that in some way equalizes the disparity between the individuals and between prosecutors, which would take out a lot of the coercion arguments. So something like this could be increasing funding to increase the quality of public defenders, to grant individuals access to counsel during the plea bargaining process. This argument could then be coupled with something that parallels the libertarianism NC, which I will get to later in the topic analysis, about how it's an extension of individual freedom to be able to decide to plead guilty at a particular stage in the trial if they believe that there's not a benefit to the case going any further. The next AF that I think will be a strong argument on this topic is the Rawls AF, which talks about justice's fairness. The central idea in this position is that the only way that we can have a fair distribution of the criminal justice system is if there is equitability in sentencing. This means that individuals should receive a sentence that is proportionate to the crime they have committed, which also requires that individuals do not arbitrarily receive shorter or longer sentences that are not related to the degree of the crime that they committed. There are a couple of components of why plea bargaining is something that would problematize the ability to give fair sentences. The first one is that individuals can be rewarded for giving up rights. So an individual would be incentivized not to go to trial because they could receive something such as a shorter sentence. This seems to be problematic given that the right to trial is something that is often considered fundamental, especially given the fact that many individuals who are innocent might simply not have the resources to go to trial, which would problematize their ability to receive a fair sentence, as they would be rewarded for not having access to something that they should be granted on the basis of their humanity. There also might be differences in sentencing based on things that are arbitrary and not due to individuals. So, for example, there might be an instance in which someone involved in organized crime receives a shorter sentence because they had information that would be useful to the prosecution. In this situation, someone who had committed a worse crime might receive a shorter sentence because of something arbitrary like the amount of information that they possess. This seems to be something that is unfair given the consideration that a sentence should be proportionate to the degree of crime that's committed. The next argument in this position that's pretty similar to the claim in the Kant AF is that coercion and due process would be compromised by a system in which individuals often plead guilty for crimes. In a system in which 90% of cases are decided due to pleas, there's not a prioritization of the quality of evidence that is presented, and there's also not a situation in which each individual case is seen through fully in order to accurately assess the guilt or innocence of an individual. Especially given the role of coercion in situations where individuals do not have adequate resources or are afraid of the jury's ability to reach an accurate conclusion, it would definitely compromise the rights that individuals are due within a trial. The potential issues I see with this position are first reform counterplans, similar to the ones that I talked about with the Kant AF, which would seem to be able to resolve some components of plea bargaining, since it doesn't seem to be an inherent problem with plea bargaining in itself, but rather with some sort of contingent issue. So, for example, there might be a counterplan that says that individuals should not be given lesser sentences for giving up particular information, or a counterplan that increases individual access to resources in trials, such that they do not feel they have a limited ability to end up going to trial. The other potential issue, which you will just generally run into whenever you read a Rawls AF, is the argument that ideal theory is bad. You're probably familiar with this argument, but the general claim is just that a theory that abstracts away from particular material conditions and makes presumptions about how the world should work, then applying those sort of presumptions to the way that we should act, is problematic because it erases particular material issues of injustice. I think there are potentially some good responses to ideal theory bad, because it is important to theorize how the world should work whenever we are taking out any sort of action about the way that we want to structure things. So particularly with this resolution, we want some sort of idea of what we want the criminal justice system to look like in order to engage in any sort of discussion about the way that we want to alter it. I think that also a potentially strong way to deal with this objection is to incorporate some level of critical theory into the contention level of this position. So if you talk about the role of things like race and gender in the way in which individuals are coerced within the system of plea bargaining, then it would take out the claim that you are erasing any sort of issue of material injustice. The next position that I think is decent, although not the strongest on this topic, is the virtue AF. So, virtue ethics answers the question of, in general, what kind of people we ought to be. So, while some positions, such as utilitarianism, simply focus on the validity of our actions, as isolated from the people that are carrying out the actions, virtue ethics says that we care about particular traits that are desirable or undesirable. So, for example, if an individual is dishonest and generally doesn't prioritize the truth, they might still have a problematic orientation towards the world, even if they never encounter a situation in which it's advantageous to lie. So the idea of virtue ethics is that dishonesty might be something that is a problematic orientation towards the world. So we should take actions that try to minimize vices and promote virtues. So the claim for why plea bargaining is not virtuous is that it rewards betrayal, dishonesty, and selfishness. So this position would primarily deal with instances in which individuals give up information in order to receive a shorter sentence. So the idea is that an individual who decides to betray people that they worked with in order to receive a lesser sentence is an individual who is violating the trust of the people that they worked with. Trust is something that is generally considered to be a good thing, as lying to other individuals and being dishonest is something that prevents us from flourishing, as it is detrimental to human relationships and also detrimental to our respect of other people. It also would seem to prioritize selfishness, as individuals who care about their own well-being over the well-being of other people would be prioritized within the criminal justice process because they would receive rewards and receive shorter sentencing. I think that there are a lot of potential issues with this position, though, so I would definitely look first to the other cases because I think they're a lot stronger. The first one is that you probably need to run a plan. If you read a general aff about how plea bargaining is something that disincentivizes virtue, people could just read a counterplan about how we should not have plea bargaining in instances in which people are rewarded for provision of information. The second question is, do we care about trust among criminals? So in a situation in which people trust each other because it enables them to accomplish something that is deceptive and something that is harmful to the rest of society, trust seems to be something that is less valuable. The potential response that this aff would have to this is that there are varying degrees of criminality, and that there are varying reasons that people become criminals. So this sort of system in which we say that all criminals are bad is something that ignores the fact that a lot of individuals resort to crime because of things like social disadvantages. That doesn't mean that they're bad people, it just means that they have had some sort of disadvantage that shaped the way that they interact with the world. So you could potentially read some sort of critical argument about a response that says that we don't care about trust within criminal organizations. The potential response to that, though, is that when individuals are betraying the people that they worked with, it's not an act of selfishness or dishonesty in which they are prioritizing their own needs above the needs of someone else, but rather that they could be providing information because they realize that what they've done is wrong and because they are serving the interests of society. So that provision of information is something that can be helpful and is something that would be able to combat future harms to individuals. The potential response to that, though, is that if the individual is so selfless, they should just take the punishment and then provide the information regardless, which I think is probably true, which is why I think that this is an interesting position and an interesting way to look at the resolution, but probably not the truest one. Next aff is Civic Republicanism. I like this aff a lot. I think this might be my favorite aff on the topic, because I think it accurately promotes an image of what the criminal justice system ought to look like. I think the strongest philosophical positions on this topic are going to deal with the question of what we want our criminal justice system to do, what the role of punishment should be, and what functional role a trial has in the process, and why it should serve that particular purpose, and in what way we can allow it to cohere with the objectives we see the criminal justice system to be having. So civic republicanism cares a lot about due process because it cares about representation of individuals in society and says that there cannot be an arbitrary influence of the government on individuals. So if there is a situation in which the government just arbitrarily decides what rights you have and what rights should be deprived without your consent, that is problematic because your freedom is not something that is able to be expressed within the system. So the idea of due process is super important to that. Since the government should not be able to arbitrarily influence their power over you, there should be a process by which individuals are heard out to ensure that the decision that is reached among a particular crime is representative of something that is not arbitrary. Civic republicanism also cares a lot about checks and balances because it cares that there's no one individual in society that has all of the power to decide what happens to individuals, but rather that there is some sort of interdependency and that there are checks that one entity is not able to be granted too much power over individuals. So the claim here would generally be along the lines of the claims that are talked about in the previous aff about how individuals give up their trial rights, which compromises the ability of trials to reach an accurate conclusion because they're no longer focused on issues just like innocence and guilt, but rather economic interests, efficiency interests can take priority. Individuals can also be coerced, which means that the result of a trial is determined based on arbitrary processes. The next argument would be about checks and balances. So the claim would then be that the criminal justice system largely would function, and that results would be brought about largely in terms of what the prosecutor decides to do. So the prosecutor would be able to say things such as the likely outcome of a trial if the individual were to decide not to plead guilty, which means that they have a very large amount of power that is not checked by other individuals such as a judge and a jury. In an actual trial, there are a larger number of procedural checks to ensure that one individual is not the one who is deciding the outcome of something so significant. The claim is that it becomes a perversion of democracy if we do not have checks on prosecutorial power that would decide the outcome of a criminal trial. Potential answers to this AF would include the court clog disad. So some claim that the criminal justice system literally cannot function unless we have plea bargaining. There could also be a reform counterplan, so some sort of institution of supervision over prosecutors to ensure that they don't have absolute power, or there could be some sort of changing of the plea bargaining process. So, for example, I looked at one counterplan, which I will talk briefly about later, which talked about how there should be a different prosecutor in the case that the case actually ends up going to trial, and in the case that there is a plea, so that the individual doesn't have as much power over the outcome of the later trial. But I think that those arguments are definitely easy to deal with, and that this app could be super well frontlined to have a very cohesive theory of democracy that would be pretty strong. So for neg, I think in general the best ground on this topic is counterplans, because I don't think that there is a good defense of plea bargaining as it currently is, because there are so many disparities in resources that make it such that it's pretty inequitable in the way that in the outcome of cases, and that there are also pretty disastrous impacts of the current system of plea bargaining. So, for example, there is a disincentive to individuals bringing things to trial at all if there is a large chance that it will require a large number of resources. But if it's just in a situation in which someone will plead guilty and it does not require a large number of resources, then there will be a much larger number of criminal convictions, which can be problematic for things like mass incarceration, for democracy, for freedom. So most philosophical theories will have a problem with the current system. So I think that the best ground is looking for ways in which we can reform the system to enable plea bargaining to exist as an enhancement of individual freedom, so it becomes an opportunity that individuals can use in order to exercise their rights in the criminal process without becoming something that is just lorded over them to encourage them to give up their right to trial. So I think the first and most straightforward negative position is the libertarianism NC. So the general claim for libertarianism and plea bargaining is that plea bargaining promotes compromise and negotiation. So libertarianism says that the free market is generally the best way that we can solve problems, because in the free market, individuals are able to represent their disparate interests and come to some sort of conclusion about something that is in their mutual interest. The general idea here is that individuals, to some degree, have a level of congruence in their interests, such that negotiation is the best way that there can be something that is representative of all. If the government were to interfere and impose some sort of solution on individuals, there is less of a chance that it will cohere with what either party in the negotiation wants. There are also components of the theory that talk about freedom and how freedom is deprived if individuals are not the one who determine what the outcome is for the particular situation in which they're involved. So I think potential concerns with this NC. The first one is whose interest is promoted. So the claim of the NC is that plea bargaining enables the prosecutor and the defendant to discuss some sort of mutually advantageous outcome, such that the prosecutor's interest and the defendant's interest are able to be considered on the table. However, it does seem to be the case that the interests that are at stake in a criminal trial are not those solely of the defendant and the prosecutor, but that there are overall societal implications for the trial, and that there are also implications for the victim of the crime, who are often going to be excluded from the conversation, even though there are some ways in which they're considered. So, for example, there are some states that currently require that the victim of a crime sign off in a situation where a case might be resolved in a plea bargaining, so the victim has to agree that plea bargaining is the way that the case will be resolved. But even in that situation, the victim is not the one who is primarily being considered. So it seems to be a potential issue that it seems to be a compromise between parties who a compromise between them is not necessarily what criminal trials are looking for. The other issue is the question of if bargaining power is equal. So the idea of two individuals being able to negotiate and reach an agreement that represents what both of them want seems to presuppose that both parties are able to equally advocate for what they want and are able to be equally represented in the outcome. But if there are problems in the criminal justice system, which there are, in which individuals face economic pressures, social pressures to plead guilty, then it doesn't seem to be the case that their interests will necessarily be promoted. So I think there are a lot of potential ways you could deal with these responses. I think that this NC probably needs to be run with a counterplan. So one counterplan that seems interesting is a restorative justice counterplan. So this is something that the plea bargaining dialogue would become a conversation that exists between the victims of a crime, between the prosecutors, and between the defendant. So that would enable there to be a decision that is reached that is more closely representative of the interests of all of the parties who matter. The problem here is that there seems to be a larger societal interest in the outcome of a crime, in the outcome of a trial, because crimes have a impact on society in general. So it doesn't necessarily seem to be the case that that would take into account societal interest, although it could be argued that the prosecutor has societal interest in mind when they are determining what the potential outcome of a trial would be. I think, though, that you could couple this counterplan with a reform counterplan, which would talk about ways that we could change the current system to make it a much more equitable representation of individual interests. So these include things like the stuff that I was talking about before, where you have different people that are involved, different individuals acting as the prosecutor if the case goes to trial and if the case is just being pled, because they wouldn't be able to leverage the same amount of power about the outcome of a criminal trial. There could also be the institution of agencies that would keep watch on plea bargaining to ensure that there isn't any sort of abuse of power. There could be the removal of things like shortening sentences as a result of plea bargaining, so that individuals would just be pleading guilty to remove the potential time that they have to that they would have to wait for a trial. There could also be the investment in additional resources so that individuals have better defenses, which would mean that they would have less of a fear of going to trial because there's a higher probability that they have someone who could adequately defend them. And then there could be other forms of reform, other reforms that are external to plea bargaining. So, for example, things that, such as like legalization of certain drugs, would probably decrease the pressure on the criminal justice system, or other things that can be legalized, which would increase the availability of resources that can be reallocated to ensure that individuals have adequate defense by decreasing overcrowding. Next NC is pragmatism. So this pragmatism NC would see plea bargaining as a necessary tool for defendants. So it increases the opportunities that they have and the manners that they have to resolve a criminal trial. So the idea here is generally that plea bargaining does not is that an abolition of plea bargaining doesn't have the ability to account for the particularity of individual criminal trials. So there might be certain circumstances in which plea bargaining is advantageous, and that the general problems with plea bargaining are a justification for reforms rather than a problematization of the entire system at large. The additional claim, so it generally says that abolition is too absolute. So we should look at plea bargaining on a case-by-case basis, and we should reform by looking at the particular problem that's at hand. So, for example, if the issue is that plea bargains are currently coercive, we should then invest in ensuring individuals have access to, for example, counsel during plea bargaining, so that they have someone who can defend them to ensure that prosecutors don't wield too much power. The potential problems here are the question of what defines something being too absolute. So potentially any policy could be made more and more particularist until it's deciding everything on an individual level. So what does it mean for something to become too absolute a solution to a problem when pretty much everything is a generalization and an absolute way of dealing with something? I think the response to this would just be that it is a comparison. So if you're providing evidence about why something is so absolute that it ignores something that should be essential to in a given moment to deciding the outcome of a criminal trial, then that would be a reason that something is too absolute. So what is absolute would be determined in terms of practical consequences on a given instance. So if you can provide practical negative impacts of the absoluteness of a complete abolition of plea bargaining, then that would be a reason to prefer your position. The other similar objection to this NC would be the claim that the defendant's ability for experimenting with a variety of tools does not place any sort of bright line on what tools individuals should have accessible to them. But I think the response to this objection would be similar, in that you would be talking about the practical and tangible effect that it would have for particular defendants, and why plea bargaining is something that could be a useful tool in a variety of instances. I also think that this is another NC that would be well coupled with a counterplan about reform, because it would make very persuasive the claim that the act does not actually address the root of the problem and overgeneralizes way too much an issue that can be solved with a more particular reform. So thank you guys for listening to this topic analysis. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about anything that I talked about, or have any questions about how to get started writing any of these positions. I think this is a super interesting topic. It has a lot of really interesting philosophical questions that will definitely push you to think about what the ideal role of the criminal justice system should be in the United States. So happy casing.